In this video, we're going to build a password manager. So what will you learn by watching this video? You're going to learn various hashing and encryption strategies. You're going to learn how password managers work. You're going to learn some basic React and some basic TypeScript. Technologies that we're going to use to build our password manager are Fastify, and this is going to be our web server. We're going to use TypeScript for static type checking. We're going to use Next.js as our front-end framework. We're going to use Chakra UI for our React component library, and we're going to use MongoDB as our database. The video will take the following structure. First, we're going to do an application demonstration. Then we're going to do a code walkthrough. Then we're going to set up our server. We're going to set up our client. We're going to build out our user registration. We're going to build out our user login. And finally, we're going to build out our vault management. Before we get started, there's a few things you need to know about hashing and encryption. Hashing and encryption are two different things. Hashing is one way, so hash data cannot be unhashed. You can simply hash it again and compare the two outcomes. So for example, when you store passwords in a database, you will hash the user's password, and then when they try to log in, you'll hash their candidate password and you'll compare the two hashes to see if their candidate password was the password that they originally put in when they registered. Encryption, on the other hand, is two-way. So encrypted data can be decrypted if you know the correct string or key. The algorithms that we're going to use are SHA-256. The algorithms that we're going to use in this video are SHA-256, and this is so we can create a predictable password hash. We're going to use Argon2 to create an unpredictable password hash to store in our database. We're going to use PBK-DF2 to generate our vault key. And then we're going to encrypt and decrypt our vault with AES-256. So this is the flow that our data is going to take. So you'll notice that the client and server are separated here. And that's because the separation between the client and the server, in this case, is very important. We're going to assume that we can't trust our server. So any data that goes to the server, we need to assume that an attacker is looking at that data. So all of our encryption and decryption needs to take place on the client. So when we register, this is going to be a fairly standard flow. We're going to hash our password on the client with SHA-256, and we're going to send along a plain text email. On the server, we're going to generate a hash from that password with Argon2. We're going to create a user. We're going to create a salt string, and we're going to create a vault. When we log in, we're going to hash our password again with SHA-256, and we're going to send along a plain text email. Then we'll find the user, we'll find the vault, we'll sign a JWT, and then we'll send back the encrypted vault, the vault salt, the user, and a JWT. When we get our encrypted vault, we're going to generate a vault key, and we're going to do this by concatenating the email and master password along with the salt that is stored on the server, and we're going to use PBK-DF2 to create a vault key. Then we can use that vault key to decrypt our vault with AES. And then when we go to save our vault, we can encrypt the data with our vault key and then send it along to the server. So this is the application that we're going to be building. You can see that we have a login form here, and we can click register and we'll get taken to a registration form. I'm going to inspect element so we can see all the network requests that are being sent to the server. I'm just going to register with an email of t@t.com and a password of password. When I click register, you can see that I sent this network request here to users, and you can see that my email is t@t.com, but my password is this encrypted password, and this is a SHA-256 hash of our password. When we add an item, we can add a website, and when we save our vault, you can see that we send along our encrypted vault, and this is the vault that will get stored on the server. When we refresh, our vault is returned, and inside of our application, we store our vault key, and we store a plain text version of our vault. If we clear this out, and then we refresh, we can now log in with t@t.com and password. And you can see that for the login request, we send along our email, and again, we send along our encrypted password. And this is so that the server will never know what our plain text password is. And that's because we need our plain text password to generate a vault key. When we log in, you can see that we get back an access token, we get back our vault salt, and we get back our encrypted vault. and this is decrypted on the client, and then we're presented with our vault here. This is the application that we're going to be building. So we have this client folder and we have a server folder. In the description below, you'll see a link to the repository on GitHub. And in that repository, you're going to see a notes file. And this notes file has all the commands that you'll need to use throughout the tutorial. So in the server folder, we have a source folder and we have a certs folder. So we first start off in main, where we're going to define our main function. And then inside of main, we call create server, and create server is going to bootstrap our Fastify server. And we're going to register a few plugins here. One of the plugins that we're going to use is Fastify JWT. And we're going to use Fastify JWT to sign and verify our JWTs. To sign our JWT, we're going to use a private key, and that private key is inside of this certs folder here. And we're going to read the private key with file system read file sync. Then we're going to verify our JSON web tokens with our public key, and we're going to use the RS256 algorithm to sign our keys. The next plugin is cookie, and this is so we can store our JWTs in a cookie. We have this authenticate decorator, and this is so we can authenticate certain routes. Next, we're going to register our routes for user and for Vault, and then we're just going to return the app. When we come back into main, we're going to listen on port 4000, and then we're going to connect to our database, and then we're going to run our graceful shutdown code. Inside of our modules folder, you'll see user and you'll see Vault. Both of these folders are going to look pretty much the same. So we have a controller, a model, routes, and a service. And inside of Vault, we have a controller, model, routes, and service. And we start off in the route. And in here, you can see we have a route for registering a user, and we have a route for logging in. A route is going to hit a controller, and then a controller is going to call services. And this is going to be the same for our Vault. Inside of our Vault, we only have one route, and this is to update our Vault handler. And then our Vault controller is going to call the Vault service to update a Vault. Finally, in the client, we have a source directory here. We have our pages, and we're just going to have one page. And this is going to be our home page. Our home page is going to control what step we're on, whether we're on login, register, or Vault. We're going to get a Vault and a Vault key, and we're going to get these when we log in or when we register. When we get the Vault and the Vault key, we're going to store them in session storage. And this is so they get wiped from history when the user leaves this session. If the step is register, we're going to render our register form. If it's login, we're going to register our login form. Otherwise, if the step is Vault, we're going to register our Vault. Let's have a look in the register form. And the interesting piece of code here is this one here. So when we successfully register, we're going to get our encrypted password and our email, and then we're going to generate a Vault key. We're going to set our Vault key in session storage, and then we're going to use that Vault key to decrypt our Vault. Then we're going to set our Vault, and we're going to set our Vault key, and these are set inside of index. Next, we're going to set our Vault inside of session storage, and then we're going to set the step to Vault. So now that the step is Vault, our Vault will be rendered. And inside of our Vault, we're using React hook form, and this is just going to be an array of fields. So we're going to use useFieldArray. And then when we save our Vault, we're going to encrypt the Vault with our Vault key, and we're going to JSON stringify the Vault. And then we're going to set the Vault in session storage. And this is an updated version of our Vault. And then we're going to call our mutation with our encrypted Vault. And this is going to save the Vault on the server. So let's get started building this password manager. I'm going to first create the server. So I'm going to right click and create a new folder. And I'm going to call this folder server. And then inside of server, I'm going to create a new file. And then inside of server, I'm going to create a new folder called src, and this is just going to hold all of our source code. I'm going to cd inside of server, and I'm going to run yarn init, and this is going to initialize our package. After I've run yarn init, I'm going to initialize TypeScript with npx tsc --init. If you see this message here, this is not the TSC command you're looking for. It says you need to install TypeScript first. So let's do that. Yarn add TypeScript -d to install it as a development dependency. Now we can try initialize TypeScript, and you can see that it creates a tsconfig file for us now. Let's install the rest of our development dependencies. Again, you can find this install command in this notes file. And then I'm going to install my dependencies. One of the dependencies we installed is called Argon 2. And if you have any issues installing Argon 2, make sure you're using a newer version of Node.js. You can see that I'm using version 16.3.1 here. The first thing I'm going to do inside of our source directory is create a new file, and this is going to be called main.ts. And I'm just going to console.log hello from main. And then inside of the package.json, I'm going to create a scripts. And then inside of scripts, I'm going to create a script called dev. And this script is going to say ts nd, and this is for ts node dev. You can also say ts node dev, but I like to use ts nd. I'm going to put exit child transpile only. And then we need to give it a path to the file that we want to start. And ours is src/main.ts. Let's try run this with yarn dev. And I have an error here. I put exist child instead of exit. Let's try this again. And you can see we get hello from main, and then it just exits. So that's okay. We'll create a new folder and we'll call this utils. And inside of utils, I'm going to create a new file called create server.ts. And the reason I like to separate our server creation from our main is because it makes testing easier. So inside of create server, I want to say function create server. And then we can export default create server. Next, I want to say const app is equal to Fastify. And we can simply return app. Let's come back to main.ts. I can say function main. And then we can just execute main. And I want to say const app is equal to create server. And now we can get our app to listen. So I can say try const URL is equal to await app.listen. I want to listen on port 4000, and I want to set the host to 0.0.0.0. Next, I need to catch the error if we have one when we try start our server, and main needs to be an async function because we're using await. If we run into an error, I want to call process.exit, and I want to exit with a status code of 1, and I just want to console.error out our error. Let's try run yarn dev again. And you can see that we get hello from main, and our server doesn't exit anymore because we're blocking it with app.listen. So we can say console.log server is ready at, and then we can just put in our URL. Let's save and it should restart. And now in the console, we get server is ready at localhost port 4000. Before we go any further, I want to set up another util for logging. So I'm going to create a file inside of utils called logger.ts. Inside of the logger file, I'm going to import Pino from Pino, and Pino is going to be our logger. Next, I'm going to say const logger is equal to Pino, and then we can export default logger. And inside of Pino, I'm just going to pass in some options to format our logs. So I'm going to say pretty print. And then inside of pretty print, I'm going to have one property called ignore. And then I'm going to put hostname. And this is so we don't print out our hostname inside of our logs. Let's go back into our main file and I'm going to import the logger. And then I'm going to use logger.info. And then for our error, I can use logger.error. Let's save this. And you can see here, we now get a nice log. The next utility I'm going to create is our database connection. So inside of utils, I'm going to create a new file called db.ts. And then inside of our database, I'm going to import mongoose from mongoose. Next, I'm going to say export async function connect to db. I'm going to create a try catch block. And inside of our try catch block, I'm going to say await mongoose.connect. And we need to connect to a database URL. So inside of our source folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to call this constants.ts. And inside of our constants, this is just going to hold some variables we can use throughout our application. So I'm going to say export const db connection string is equal to process.env .db connection string, or I'm just going to use this connection string here. And this is going to create a database called password manager. You obviously need to have Mongoose running on your local server for this to work. Inside of Mongoose Connect, we can use our db connection string. Inside of our error, we just want to logger.error e, and then we can say error connecting to database. If we do get an error when we're trying to connect to our database, we also want to exit the process because there's nothing we can do without a database connection. So I'm going to call process.exit, and we're going to exit with a status code of 1, which is an error. Next, I want to export async function disconnect from db. Inside of this function, I'm going to call await mongoose.connection.close. I'm going to logger.info disconnected from db, and then we're just going to return. And we're going to use our disconnect from db inside of our graceful shutdown. So let's go do that now. Outside of our main function, I'm going to create a function called graceful shutdown. And this is going to take 2 arguments. The first one is our signal, and this is just going to be a string. The next one is our app, and this is going to be a Fastify instance. Next, we're going to say process.on signal. We give this an async callback. So what this is going to do is it's going to say when we get a shutdown signal, such as sigterm or sigint, then perform these procedures. So firstly, we want to logger.info says goodbye dot signal, and then we can just print out the signal that we got. We need to put these inside template strings. Then we can call app.close. And this is going to close off our Fastify instance. Next, we can say await disconnect from db. Then we can log out again. There's my work here is done. And then finally, we want to call process.exit, and we just want to exit with a status code of 0. So next we need to use our graceful shutdown function. So I'm going to define a list of signals that we want to listen to. So I'm going to say const signals is equal to an array. And I want to listen to sig term and sig int. Next, I just want to loop through the signals. So I'm going to say let I is equal to 0. I listen signals dot length I plus plus. Next, I want to call graceful shutdown. And I want to pass in the signal that we got. So I'm going to say signals, use I, and then we can pass in our app. So you can see here, we get this message child got sig term exiting. If we press Control C, we get messages in the console that says goodbye got sig int, disconnecting from database, and then my work here is done, and then the application exits. You may have noticed in the console here, we get this Pinot warning here, pretty print is deprecated. And I know people in the comment section are going to point that out. So we can fix that by coming into our Pinot here, and we can say transport, and then we can say target, and our target can be Pinot pretty. And then when we save that, the warning goes away. You can also pass some options in here. And I want to pass in the ignore. And I want to ignore hostname. You see this number down here, 5934. This is the process ID. And if you want to ignore that, you can also ignore PID. And then you can see that we don't get the process ID anymore. However, I find having it there can be handy. So now that we've got our server running, let's go install our plugins inside of Create Server. So the first plugin I want to install is Cause. So I'm going to say app.register, and I want to register a plugin called Cause. We of course need to import Cause from @fastify/cause. And I want to give this some properties. The first property is going to be origin. And let's go back to our constants, and I'm going to export const cause origin is equal to process.env.cause origin or HTTP localhost port 3000. And this is the port that our client is going to be running on. So we can use this with cause origin. And then I want to give this one more property, and that is going to be credentials, and I set credentials to true. The next plugin I want to register is, so I'm going to say app.register JWT, and we of course need to import JWT. So import JWT from @fastify/JWT. We want to give this some properties as well. You can give Fastify JWT a secret that is just a string, but we want our application to be extra secure, and so we're going to use public and private keys. So I'm going to say secret, and then I'm going to give secret a property called private, and then our private is going to be fs, and we need to import fs. You don't need to install anything for fs. This is just native to Node. .read file sync. And read file sync takes one argument, and this is just going to be the path to our file. So to get this, I'm going to say path, and we need to import path. Import path from path. And again, path is just part of Node. .join process.cwd. Then we want to get our certs folder. Then the cert that we want to get is /private.key. And inside of the server folder here, I have these certificates. And you can get these certificates at this website here, this Travis Idwell. And this is going to be your private key, and this is going to be your public key. Just save those in files called private.key and public.key. As you can see, I've done here, private and my public key. Please don't use these keys because these are going to be on GitHub, and I've just shown these here on YouTube. The next key that we need to set up is going to be our public key. And our public key is going to be used to verify that our token was signed by its private key pair. So public fs.read file sync. And we can just copy this path here, and then we can change private here to public. We have a little error here, and that's because CWD is actually a function, and we need to execute that to get the string value. And CWD just returns the current working directory for the node process. So that's going to be this server folder here. So after our secret object, we need to give this another property called sign. And we need to specify the algorithm we're going to use. So I can say algorithm, and then this is going to be RS256. Next, we want to specify a cookie name that JWT is going to be able to look into to find our JWT. So I can say cookie name, and this is going to be token. You can call this whatever you like. You can call it JWT, you can call it access token, something like that. And next, I want to set signed to false. So the next plugin we need to set up is cookie. And so this is so we can sign cookies. So I can say app.register cookie. And this is imported as Fastify cookie. I just want it to import as cookie. I'm just going to change that import. And you can put some pass options here if you like. So you can put an object, and then you can say pass options, and then you can give this an object of properties. But I don't need any pass options. So the next thing we want to do to set up a server is to set up an authentication decorator. So I can say app.decorate, and I want to call this authenticate. And if this doesn't make sense, I'm going to come back to this when we go to use it. Next, I want to give this an async function. And this is going to take our request, which is going to be of type Fastify request. Then we're going to have our reply, which is going to be of type Fastify reply. And next, I want to try verify our token. So I'm going to say try and catch const user is equal to await request dot JWT verify. And then we just need to execute the JWT verify function. JWT verify takes a generic here, and this is the verified payload type. So we can put in a type here, and this is going to be our type of our user. So I'm just going to say _ID is going to be a string. And then our user here is just going to be an object with one property of ID. Next, we want to attach our user to our request object. So I'm going to say request.user is equal to user. And then finally, if we catch an error, I just want to return reply.send, and I'm just going to send the error along. So this is all for our create server for now. The next thing to do is to create our modules. So inside of the source directory, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this modules. Inside of modules, I'm going to create one folder called user, and I'm going to create another module called vault. You can store your vault and your user together if you like. You could just store the vault on the user model, and that would work perfectly fine. However, I'm going to separate them because you may run into a scenario where you want to have several vaults for a user. And in that case, it's going to be easier to have your vault as a separate module. So inside of user, I'm going to create a new file called user.controller.ts, user.model.ts, user.service.ts, and then user.routes.ts. Inside of vault, I'm going to do the same. So I'm going to say vault.controller.ts, vault.model.ts, vault.service.ts, and then vault.route.ts. So I'm just going to set up the routes for now, and that's so we can finish off our create server function. So inside of user route, I'm going to say function user routes, and I'm going to export default user routes. And user routes is going to take an app, and this is going to be a Fastify instance. We're going to get some options here, and these are going to be Fastify plugin options. And then we're going to get a done function, and the done function is going to return an error. It's optional, and that's going to be a Fastify error. and then it's just going to return void. So inside of our routes, I'm just going to execute the done function, and that's it for our user route for now. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come over to Vault routes, and then I'm just going to rename this to Vault, save that, and then we can come over to create server, and then under our authentication decorator, I'm going to say app.register, and essentially our routes are just plugins that we're going to register. I want to register user routes, and then I want to pass in some options here. So the option is going to be prefix, and I'm going to prefix all of our user routes with API/users. I'm going to do the same with Vault routes, and I'm going to prefix those with API/Vault. Okay, so that's our server set up and ready to go. Let's go bootstrap our client. So I have a new terminal here, and you can see that I'm in server. Make sure you cd back into the root of your project. I'm going to use this command here, yarn create next app with TypeScript, and I'm going to name it client. So once we've finished bootstrapping our next application, I'm going to install some dependencies. So I'm going to cd into client, and I'm going to install these dependencies. And then I just have one development dependency to install here. I'm going to install that. And now that we've installed all of our dependencies, I'm going to type yarn dev, and this is going to start our client on localhost port 3000. Let's go do some setup for our client. So come into pages, and inside of the underscore app, we need to install Chakra UI. You can use any component library that you like. Another good one is Mantine UI. And I just thought that I would mix it up and use Chakra in this tutorial. Let's import from at Chakra UI/React. And we need to import the Chakra provider. And then we just need to wrap our component here in the Chakra provider. And that's it for setting up Chakra UI. The next thing we need to set up is React Query. And we're just going to use React Query to send HTTP requests to our server. So I'm going to import from React Query, Query Client, and Query Client Provider. Above our app function, I'm going to say const query client is equal to new query client. And this, of course, needs to be lowercase. Then we can create a new provider called query client provider. And then we need to give this a client is going to be equal to our query client. And then we need to close our query client provider below our Chakra provider. The next thing I want to do is to set up my environment variables. So inside of client, let's create a new file, and I'm going to call this .env.local. Then I'm going to say next public API endpoint is equal to HTTP localhost port 4000. And we need this next public here because this endpoint here needs to be public. If we just had it as API endpoint, we'd only be able to access this environment variable on the server. Let's also move everything into a folder called source. And I can move the pages into the source file. I also want to move public into source. And I also want to move styles into source. And this just makes it a little easier to see all of our files that we're working on. Inside of pages, we have this API folder. We can just delete that. We're not going to use it. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'll call this folder components. And this is where we're going to create our login form, registration form, and a form wrapper and our Vault component. So let's create a register form.tsx. There's a function register form. And I'm going to export default register form. And for now, we're just going to return a div that says register. Let's create a login form.tsx. The function login form that's just going to return a div that says login, export default login form. I'm going to create another file, and this is going to be called vault.tsx. Function vault, export default vault. And so return a div, and inside of that div, you guessed it, it's just going to say vault. Okay, so inside of our index page, I want to create our steps. So I can just delete everything inside of main here, and we can delete our footer. At the top, I want to say const equals use state. And I'm just going to default my state to login. I'm going to call this step and set step. And there's only 3 strings that we accept in here. The first one is login. The second one is register. And then the third one is vault. Add our main back. And then we want to say step is equal to register. Then we want to render our register form. We'll copy this 3 times. And if our next step is equal to login, then I want to register the login form. Otherwise, if it's equal to vault, I want to render the vault form. Let's go have a look at our application. And you can see here, as expected, it says login. I'm just going to change the default step to register for now, because we're going to go through and build out our registration. Let's come back to our server, and inside of the modules, user, and user service, to register a user, we need several different functions. So the first function we need is to generate a salt. And a salt is just a random string, basically. And then the next function we need is to create a user. Okay, so to create a user, we need a user model. So let's go create the user model first. So I'm going to use TypeGoose to create the model, and TypeGoose is going to allow us to export an interface and a model from the same class. So I'm going to say export class user. And our user is just going to have 2 properties. The first one is going to be email, and then the second one is going to be password. Our password is going to be a string, and our email is going to be a string. These are just TypeScript types. To create a Mongoose type, we need to use @prop, which comes from TypeGoose/TypeGoose. And we're going to say our email is required. And it needs to be unique. I'm going to do the same for password, except it doesn't need to be unique. You can see that we have an error here, and it says set experimental decorators in your tsconfig to remove this warning. So let's open up our tsconfig file. And we can find set experimental decorators. And I'm just going to uncomment that. We can come back to our model and we get another error. This property email has no initializer and it's definitely not assigned in constructor. To fix this error, we need to come back into our tsconfig and we need to find this property, strict property initialization, and we need to set this to false. And now you can see that the errors have disappeared. So to export our user as a model, we can say export const user model is equal to get model for class. And we need to pass in the class user, and then we can pass in some options. So I just want to set some timestamps. So I can say schema options and then timestamps, set that to true. So when we register a user, we want to hash their password to something that is unpredictable. And to do this, we're going to use argon2. So when we save the user, we want this to happen automatically. To do that, we're going to use a pre-save hook. So I'm going to say at pre, and then pre comes from TypeGoose. I'm going to pass in the user model to the generic, and then this is going to be a pre-save hook. And then we need an async function as the callback. And the async function is just going to have a next property. So now we need to say if this.is modified, and we want to see if the password has been modified, or this.is new. So if we're changing the password or the document is new, then we want to say const hash is equal to await argon2. And for some reason, this imports funny. We can fix that. Dot hash this dot password. Next, we need to say this dot password is equal to hash. And then finally, we just need to return next. If you wanted to make your password extra secure, you could hash the email along with the password. So you could do something like this. You could say this.email colon and then this.password. And the reason that you would want to do this is if you want to force the user to provide their email address when they go to change their password. If they don't provide their email address, it's going to hash to something that they'll never be able to use again. But I think this is a little bit overkill, and so I'm just going to hash the password. Let's go back to our user service. And to create a user, I'm going to export async function, create user. We're going to have some input here. And the input is just going to be encrypted password. That's going to be a string. And then the next property is going to be email. Remember, the password that the server gets is always hashed. It's actually not encrypted. A better name for this would be hashed password, because we never want our server to see the plain text password, even if we would never store it. Next, I just want to return user model dot create, and I want to pass in the input. So we need another function here, and this is to generate our salt. And the reason that we need this function when we create a user is because when we create a user, we're also going to create a vault. So I'm going to say export function generate salt. Then I'm going to return crypto, and the crypto module is just native to Node. .random bytes, and we just want 64 random bytes. .toString, and we want to pass in hex. So this is going to return a hexadecimal string that is 65 bytes long. Because we're going to create a vault when we create a user, we first need to set up a few things for vault as well. So I'm going to create the vault model. And this is going to be a very simple model. So I'm going to export class vault. And this is going to have a property called user. And user is going to be a ref, which comes from TypeGoose. And the ref is going to be user, which comes from our user model. I'm going to give this an @prop. I'm going to say it's required true, and then it's going to have a ref to our user class. Next, we're going to have our data, and this is just going to be the data that exists inside of the vault. So @prop, I'm going to set this as default an empty string. I'm going to call this data, and it's just going to be a string. This is going to be the encrypted data that we store on the server. And then the next property is going to be our salt. So I'm going to say it's required, true. I'm going to call it salt, and it's going to be a string. And then I'm going to export const vault model is equal to get model for class vault schema options. And again, I'm just going to use timestamps. And the timestamps are just going to be created at and updated at. Okay, so in vault service, we need to be able to create a vault. So I'm going to export a function called create vault. I'm going to return vault model.create. And I'm going to pass in our input. And our input is going to be of type user, which is just going to be a string, and salt, which is just going to be a string. Okay, so now we're ready to build out a handler for registering a user. So I'm going to come over to user controller, and I'm going to export an async function called register user handler. And in here, we're going to get our request and our reply. Our request is going to be of type Fastify request. And we're going to have a generic here, and this is going to specify what properties are going to be in our body. So we're going to get parameters, type of, create user, and then we want to get the number. Okay, so what's going on here? So parameters is a utility type from TypeScript, and what it says is get the parameters that this function can be called with, and then get the 0th element of those parameters. So if we remove number here, and then we say const body is equal to request.body, you can see that body is an array of objects, but we don't want it to be an array of objects. We just want it to be the one object that we pass in. And so we use number, and now body is just an object. If you want to learn more about TypeScript utility functions, I have a very helpful video on that I'll link to in the description below. Next, let's say try, and we'll catch. We'll say const user is equal to create user, and we'll pass in our body. Don't forget to await this. Next, we can say const salt is equal to generate salt. And next, we can say const vault is equal to await create vault. And to create a vault, we need our user, and we're going to pass in our user._id, and then we're going to pass in our salt. So inside of our create user handler, I'm also going to sign an access token, so the user's logged in as soon as they register. So I can say const access token is equal to await reply.jwt sign. And we need to type our reply as Fastify reply. And I want to set two properties. I want to set the ID as user._id and the email as user.email. Okay, so now that we have our access token, we want to add a cookie to the reply. So I'm going to say reply.setCookie. And the reason that we have set cookie here is because when we created our server, we registered a cookie plugin. I'm going to call my cookie token. And remember, when we created the server, we told Fastify JWT that our cookie name was going to be token. The value is going to be our access token. And then we have an object of options. So I'm going to set domain. And I'm going to add a property to our constants. This is going to be export const cookie domain is equal to process.m.cookie domain, or I'm just going to set this to local host. Let's set our domain to our cookie domain. I'm going to set the path to just a backslash. I'm going to set this secure to false. And this is because in dev, I don't have TLS set up. In production, you'll need to make sure that you have secure set to true. And this just means that the cookie can only be sent over a HTTPS connection. I want to set HTTP only to true. And this just means the cookie cannot be accessed by JavaScript. It can only be accessed via HTTP. And I want to set same site to false. And then finally, if we've done all this successfully, I just want to reply with a code of 201, which means we created the user successfully. .send, and I want to send across our access token, our vault, which vault.data, which is just going to be an empty string for now. And I want to send the salt. If we can't register the user, I just want to logger.error, error creating user. And we can return reply.code. And I'm just going to send a 500.send, and I'm going to send the error. You could definitely improve this error handling here. Okay, so the last thing to do on the server for registering a user is to assign our handler to a route. So I'm going to come into user routes. And I'm going to say app.post/. And the reason we're using a slash here is because we registered our routes with a prefix of /API/users. And I'm going to assign this to register user handler. We have this error in the console here, error user.emails, type is invalid, type is undefined. We need to go into the tsconfig file again, and then we need to find emit decorator metadata, and then we just need to uncomment this and set it to true, and the server will start back up. Let's go over to the client and we can start working on our registration form. Before we create the form, I'm just going to create another component to wrap our form in so it looks a little bit nicer. So I'm going to call this form wrapper.tsx. I'm going to say function form wrapper. Then I'm going to export default form wrapper. And this is going to take children and some unknown props. We can type this out as children is going to be react.react_node. And then for the rest of the props, we can use a type from Chakra UI called box props. So I'm going to say our children is in this object here and box props. Next, I want to return a box. And this just means that we can pass in some props to our box here. So I'm going to say width is equal to 100%. Max width is equal to container.sm. Box shadow is going to be XL. We need to import box from Chakra UI. Our padding is going to be 8. And we're going to use a form element. So I want to say as equals form. And then we can spread our props onto here. And then finally render out our children. Let's go over to our registration form. I'm going to use the form wrapper. I'm going to have a heading here. And the heading is just going to be register. Then I'm going to have a form control. And I give this a margin top of 4. Then I'm going to have a form label. And the label is going to be email. And I'm going to give it a HTML4 for an element called email. So now we can give it an input element. And the ID needs to match the HTML4. I'm going to say ID is equal to email. And then the placeholder is going to be email. And now we need to register this field. And to do that, we need to set up our React hook form. So at the top here, I'm going to say const object is equal to use form. And from use form, we're going to get handle, submit, register, get values, set value, and form state. And from form state, we're going to get errors and is submitting. And we can type out the properties that our form is going to have by giving use form a generic type here. So we're going to have an email, which is going to be a string. We're going to have a password, which is going to be a string. Then we're going to have a hashed password, which is also going to be a string. We're not going to have a field for hashed password. We're just going to use React hook form as a state management. So inside of our form wrapper, I can give this an onSubmit. And this is going to be handle, submit. And then we can give this a callback. And we need to get our email and password. And from there, we can hash the password. And then we can call our register mutation. So I'm going to say const email is equal to get value. And the value we want to get is email. We can do the same with password. And that's all I'm going to do for handle submit for now. And we can come back to input and finish this off. So the next thing I want to do is to create some object brackets and then spread register. We need to execute this. The first property is the field that you want to register, and we want to register the email. And then you can give this some validation. So I can say required, and then I can give it an error message and say email is required. I can also give this a min length. I want to say the minimum length is 4, and the message is going to be email must be 4 characters long. Okay, if we do get an error, we want to print that to the screen. So I'm going to say form error message. Then we say error dot email and errors dot email dot message. Okay, let's copy this form control here. And I'm just going to do this again, but for password. So I'm going to change this to password, HTML4 password. Change the placeholder and register the password. The password is required. And I want to say the password must be a minimum of 6 characters long. And then I'm just going to change the type to password. Okay, let's go look at this form. And our form is coming along. It's just not in the center. And the reason for that is because we haven't applied styles to our main here. So we can use class name, and then we can just use the styles that came with Next.js when we installed. So styles.main, and then our form is in the center here. Okay, so let's go finish off the registration handler. So we said here that we need to generate a hashed password. So inside of our source directory, let's create a new file, and I'm going to call this file crypto.js. And this is just going to house all of our cryptographic functions. I'm going to export a function called hash password. And this is just going to take our password, which is going to be a string. And then we want to return SHA-256, which comes from crypto.js. And then we can just pass in our password, and then we can call .toString, execute toString, and this is just going to return a SHA-256 version of our password. So now we can say const hashed password is equal to hash password. We can pass in the password. Then we can set value hashed password, and we can set this to our hashed password. And then finally, we're going to need to call our mutation. If you want to include the email in the hash password, you can do that as well. Again, you could just do something like this, where you say email, and then the password. And you would need to pass email into this function as well, but I'm just going to hash the password. So we can actually remove get values email. Okay, so we need to set up our mutation. So I'm going to say const mutation, and this is just going to be a React query mutation equals use mutation, which comes from React query. And we need to call a function here. So inside of source, let's create a new folder, and I'm going to call this API. And I'm going to create a new file inside of API called index.ts. And in here, we need to create a register user function. So I'm going to say export async function register user. It actually doesn't need to be an async function, so I'm going to remove that. We're going to take our payload, and our payload is going to have a hashed password, which is going to be a string, and it's going to have an email, which is going to be a string as well. Then we just want to return axios.post, and we want to post this to our user base. So I'm going to say user base, and then I'm going to define a constant called user base. It's equal to process.env.next public API endpoint /API/users. And this comes from our .env.local that we set up before. Just make sure they're the same. Okay, so we want to add our payload as the body of the post request. And then we want to set an option of with credentials to true. And this is going to make sure that our cookie is set. Okay, so let's define the response of our post request here. So I'm going to say it's going to return salt of string and our vault of type string. Then we just need to call .then. We're going to get the response, and then we're going to return the response.data. So now we can call our mutation with register user, and we're going to have an onSuccess handler here. So the second argument is going to be onSuccess, and this is going to be a function, and we're going to get our salt, and we're going to get our vault. So we set a hashed password here inside of our form, and we need to get it back out again. So I'm going to say const hashed password is equal to get values, and I want to get the value hashed password. I also want to get the email, so I'm going to say const email is equal to get values, and I want to get the value email. And now we need to generate a vault key. So I'm going to say const vault key is equal to, and we can go back into our crypto module here, and I'm going to create a new function called generate vault key. So export function generate vault key. And this is going to return a consistent string given the same email, hashed password, and salt. But you need to know the email address and the original password to be able to generate this vault key. But you also need to know the salt, which is stored on the server. And to get the salt, you need to know the original email and password. So I'm going to say email, hashed, password, and salt. And email is going to be a type string. Same for hashed password and for salt. And then I'm just going to return pbkdf2, which comes from crypto, but it should be crypto.js /pbkdf2. And it's just going to be a default export from this package here. So I can execute this function, and I'm going to add the email, and I'm going to add the password. And then the second argument is going to be our salt. And then the third argument is going to be a options object. So I'm going to say key size is just going to be 32. And then I can call .toString. And now this is going to return a string. Let's come back to our register form. And our vault key is going to be equal to generate vault key. And we need to pass in our hashed password, our email, and our salt. Okay, so let's store our vault key in session storage. So when we refresh, it's still going to be there. So I'm going to say window.session_storage.setItem. And I'm just going to set this in a property called vk for vault key. And I'm going to set the vault key. The next thing I want to do is to set a property called vault. This property is just going to be an empty string when we first register. So I'm going to say window.session_storage.setItem. And I'm going to call this item vault. And I'm just going to set this to an empty string. On our index, we need to maintain our vault and our vault key. And we need to set the step. So I'm going to create two more state properties. One is vault and one is vault key. So I'm going to say const equals use state. And this is just going to be an empty array. Our vault is going to be an array. And then I'm going to say set vault. And we can type our vault as well. So I'm going to say interface vault item. And our vault item is just going to be a website, which is a string, a username, which is a string, and a password, which is a string. And then our vault is just going to be an array of vault items. And then we can set a state property for our vault key. So vault key set vault key is equal to use state, and this is just going to be an empty string. Okay, so I want to be able to pass down set vault key and set step to register. So I'm going to pass in set step equals set step and set vault equal to set vault. So we just need set vault key. I'll pass that in. And you can see that register form obviously doesn't take these properties. So let's go add them. So we're going to have a set vault and set step. And set vault is going to be of type dispatch. Set state action. And then we need to set the vault item here. So we can export that from our index. And it's going to be an array of vault items. Okay, set step is going to be very similar. So set step dispatch, set state action. We're going to pass in a generic, and the generic type is just going to be string. It's actually not just going to be string. We can do better than that. We can say that it's going to be login or register or vault. Okay, so inside of our mutation, we can set the step here to vault. So this means when you register, it's just going to go straight to your vault. And we actually don't need set vault. We need set vault key. So we don't need the vault item. This is just going to be string as well. Let's set the vault key down here. And we can set this to vault key. Okay, so we have this mutation. We just need to call this mutation now. Okay, so come down to the handler and we can call mutation dot mutate. And then we can pass in our email and a hashed password. We actually do need to get our email in here. We can get that with get values. Okay, so let's go try this out. We actually need a submit button here. Otherwise we can't submit the form. So let's go add that. Down below our last form control, I'm going to add a button. This button is going to say register. And the type is going to be submit. Let's go back. 1@1.com and password to register. And it's saying here user validation failed, password is required. Let's go have a look in our user controller and we can see what's going on here. When we create a user, we're just creating it with the body, but when we create a user, we require a password and our body includes a hashed password. And this is fine like this. So when we're going to create user, instead of input, we can say email is input.email, and then password is going to be input.hashed password. Okay, let's try this again. And we got a timeout here, and this is because of a mistake that we made a long time ago. And when we set up our main file here, we never actually connected to our database. So let's do that. So I'm going to say connect to DB, and I'm also going to await that. Let's try this again. Now we get our vault. When we register, we get an access token, we get our salt, and we get our empty vault. You can see here, we also have an access token set in our cookies. So while we're logged in, we can build out our vault. So I'm going to come back to our server, and inside of the vault service, I'm going to create another function for updating a vault. So I'm going to say export function update vault. I'm going to take the user ID and the data. The user ID is going to be a string. The data is also going to be a string. Next, I'm going to return vault model dot update 1. And I'm going to update the vault where the user ID is equal to our user ID. So I'm going to say user equal to our user ID. And then I'm just going to set our data. Inside of our vault controller, I'm going to create a handler for updating our vault. So I'm going to export async function update vault handler. We're going to take our request and our reply. Our request is going to be a Fastify request. And we can type out the body. And the body is going to be an encrypted vault, and that's going to be a string. And then our reply is going to be a Fastify reply. Okay, so I'm going to get the user from the request. So I'm going to say const user ID is equal to get, and I'm just going to use Lodash's get function here. Request user dot underscore ID. So why is user on request? Well, if we come back to build server, we created this decorator here for authenticate, and we're going to add this decorator to our update vault route. And this means that this function here is going to get called and a user is going to be added to the request. Let's come back to the vault controller. And I'm going to say try, and then I'm going to catch any errors. Await, update, vault. The data is going to be request.body.encrypted vault. And then the user ID is going to be a user ID. If we update the vault successfully, I'm going to return reply.code 200.send vault updated. And I put this inside the catch block, but it should actually go inside the try block. If we get an error, I'm going to logger.error, error updating vault. Then I'm going to return reply.code 500.send e. Again, this error handling here could be better. You could test for different errors and send back a better status code. Okay, so come over to the vault route. And I'm going to create one route here for app.put. And this is because we're just going to replace the data inside of the vault. And it's going to be on our index because we set a prefix of /API/vault. Let's put some options on here, and I'm going to have one option for on request. Then I'm going to call app.authenticate. And then the final argument is going to be our update vault handler. Okay, so authenticate doesn't exist on app, and that's okay. We can tell TypeScript that it does. If we come back over to create server, we can come up to the top and we can say declare module Fastify, and we can export interface Fastify instance, and then we can put authenticate, and we're just going to say authenticate is any, because we don't actually need a type on there because we're not going to call it or anything. Fastify is going to call authenticate for us. Okay, so that is the server side done for updating our vault. So come over to our vault component on the client. And I'm going to bring in some arguments here. So I'm going to say vault, and this is going to be default to an empty array. And vault key is just going to default to an empty string. And we can type this out. I can say vault is equal to vault item, and this is just going to be an array. And then vault key is going to be a string. The next thing I wanted to do is to use form. So I can say const empty object is equal to use form. And from form, I want to get control, register, handle submit, form state. Actually, I don't think we need form state, so let's leave that out for now. And then I want to use a field array. So I can say const is equal to use field array. And this comes from React Hook Form. And this is a really handy function for creating arrays of fields. And you're going to see what that looks like in a second. This takes a couple of arguments. The first one is our control, and the next one is a name for our field. And our name is just going to be vault. So I want to return a form wrapper. And inside of our form wrapper, I want to get our fields. So use field array is going to return fields. It's also going to return append and a remove function. And this is so we can append items to the field array and so we can remove items from the field array. And then fields, we're going to map through. .map. Then I'm going to get the field and the index. And then I'm going to return a box from Chakra UI. We need to add a key, and this is going to be field.id. Then we want to use form control again. So I'm going to say form control, form label. This is going to be our website. Then input. The type is going to be URL, and this just means that the browser is going to do some validation for us on the website field. The ID is going to be website. The placeholder is going to be website. And then we need to register the field. So register vault dot, and we need to get the index dot website. So what we're doing is we're registering a field on the vault property because we called our field array vault. Then we're going to get the index. So for the first item, it's just going to be 0.website. And then we just want to add one argument here, and we want to say required. And then we can add a message here. Website is required. I need to import input. And my validation object just needs to be moved up after the key for this field. So I'm just going to grab this form control and copy it, and then I'm going to paste it down 3 more times. The next field is going to be username, and the ID is going to be username. I can remove the type, and then the placeholder is going to be username. I want to register a field called username, and I can say username is required. We actually also need to add a HTML4 on our form label. So I'm going to add website as this HTML4, HTML4 username. We can come down to the password field. I'm going to change the type of the password field to password. The ID is going to be password. The placeholder is going to be password. And then the name of the field is going to be password. Password is required. And then we're going to add a label of password. And we need to add HTML4 equals password. So if we go have a look at our vault, we just get a box here with a shadow. We don't have any items, and we need to add a button so we can append items. So outside of our map here, I'm just going to add a button, and the text here is going to be add, and on click, I'm going to say call append, and then when you execute append, you need to give it a object of properties that you want to append. So I want to say website defaults to an empty string, username defaults to an empty string, and password also defaults to an empty string. You need to import button from Chakra UI. Let's go back, and you can see here that our register screen has appeared again, and that's because the default property is register. So to fix this for now, I'm just going to come back and set the default step to vault. So we can go back to our vault. And now we have this add button here. You can see that it adds all of our fields here. I want all of our fields to sit in a row. So I'm going to wrap them in a box, and I'm going to give the box a display of flex. So this box here, I'm going to say display equals flex. And you can see that now they're all sitting in a row. On the username, I'm going to give this a margin left of 2. And then I'm going to do the same for the password, and this should just space it out a little bit nicely. So we also want to be able to remove a field once we have it. So inside this box here, under the last form control, I'm going to add another button. And the button text is just going to be a minus. And then on click, it's going to call remove, and we're going to call it with the index. I'm going to make the type button. I'm going to give this a background of red.500. I'm going to give it a color of white. And I'm going to give this a font size of 2XL. I'm going to give this a margin left of 2, so it has a little bit of spacing. Let's go have a look at this. And you can see that we have our button here. When you click it, it removes that row. We can add a few more rows, and then we can click the button. I don't want the button to sit up the top here. I want it to sit in line with the fields. So we can do that by making our flex box here, align items, flex end, and now our button sits in line here. Let's just add a margin top of 4 to each row. So now they space out a little bit nicely. And I might also add a margin bottom of 4. Now our button isn't cramped up. Okay, so let's handle saving our vault. So in our form wrapper, I can give this an on submit, just like we did before. I'm going to get our vault property out. And the reason that this is in an object here is because we've given a property and the name is vault. So we can just console.log the vault. And we actually also need a save button. Let's add that. I'm going to make this type of submit. And then I'm just going to add some text of save vault. And I'm going to give this a color of teal. And I'm going to give it a margin left of 8. Let's save our vault. And you can see that the URL has changed up here and the page is refreshed. And the reason for this is because when we called on submit, we didn't pass our submit handler into the handle submit function that we get with React Hook Form. So let's do that properly. We get out our vault. And we can console.log vault. Remove all these parameters. We can add a few fields, add in some data. Click save. This needs to be a valid URL, http google.com. And you can see our vault here is an array with 2 properties, and the properties are exactly what you would expect. So each one is an object with a website username and password. So now we need to encrypt our vaults, and we can do that with AES 256, and we have our vault key, and so we can encrypt the vault with our vault key. So come back over to crypto, and I'm going to create 2 functions here, one to encrypt the vault and one to decrypt the vault. So I can say export function encrypt vault. We're going to take in our vault key and we're going to take in our vault. Vault key and vault are both going to be strings. So we can type those out. Then we can return AES. And AES comes from crypto.js. .encrypt vault and vault key. And then we just need to return .toString. Okay, so decrypting our vault is a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to export function decrypt vault. Again, we're going to take our vault key and our vault. So I'm just going to copy the inputs from our encrypt function here. So the first thing to do is to get some bytes. So I'm going to say const bytes is equal to AES dot decrypt vault, and we pass in our vault key. And then we need to turn our bytes into a UTF-8 string. So I can say const decrypted equals bytes dot toString. And then I want to call enc dot UTF-8. Okay, so now we have our decrypted vault. We need to call json.parse on the vault. So we haven't actually saved our vault yet, but when we do, we're going to save it as a JSON string. So json.parse can throw an error. So I'm going to say try, and then I'm going to catch that error. And I'm going to return json.parse decrypted .vault. And when we json.stringify the vault, we're going to stringify it in a property called vault. And the reason we're going to do that is because this AES plugin, for some reason, requires that we do that. You can't just encrypt an array and then decrypt that same array. It just doesn't work for some reason. If we catch an error, we simply want to return null. Let's come back over to our vault here. And when we save our vault, I want to say const encrypted vault is equal to encrypt vault. And I want to set our vault to a json.stringify. And I want to stringify an object, and the object has one property, and that is our vault. So this is what I was talking about, where you can't just say json.stringify your vault. It needs to have a property called vault. And that's why we need to get .vault from our json.parsed value. We also need to pass in our vault key. Okay, so when we save our vault, I want to update our session storage. So I want to say window.sessionStorage.setItem vault, and I want to set a json.stringify version of our vault. Okay, so we need to call a mutation to save our vault. So before we create the mutation, let's create the API for it. So come into our APIs here. And I want to export a function called save vault. And saved vault is going to take one argument, and this is going to be our encrypted vault. And our encrypted vault is just going to be a string. Then I want to return axios.put. And we need a vault base here. So let's copy our user base, and it's going to be /API/vault. And I'm going to call this vault base. We want to put our encrypted vault inside the body. I want to set with credentials to true, so our cookie gets sent along with the request. Then I want to call .then res, and I want to return res.data. We can come back to our vault here, and now we need to create a mutation. So I'm going to say const mutation is equal to use mutation. I'm going to pass in our save vault function. And then inside of our handle submit, I'm going to call mutation.mutate, and I'm going to pass in our encrypted vault. Okay, so let's go try save our vault here. I'm going to inspect the network requests. I'm going to add a property. It's going to be HTTP. Just going to grab the URL out of here, set the username to U, the password to P. Save this. And we have a payload here of an encrypted vault. What happens when we refresh? We don't get our vault back when we refresh. But we have it here in local storage. So let's go fix that. Come over to the index file of your application. And where we render our vault, we can pass in our vault here. And this is going to be our state parameter of vault. We can pass in our vault key. And this is going to be our state parameter of vault key. But when we refresh the page, we want to be able to get our vault and vault key out of session storage. Let's use effect to do that. So I'm going to say use effect. We need to give this a dependency array. I'm going to say const vault is equal to window.sessionStorage.getItem. Vault, I'm going to do the same with vault key. Next, I want to say if vault, then set vault to json.parse vault. You can also add this to a try catch if you like, but I'm not going to bother. If vault key, then set vault key to vault key, and then set step to vault. And vault key is actually called vault key. And set step, vault needs to be a string. Okay, so let's go refresh our page here. When we refresh, we still don't see our vault appear. So we have a vault in our session storage here. Let's go debug this. I'm just going to console.log the vault that we have. So we have this vault here, so that looks good. And we're passing the vault down to our vault component here. So let's have a look in here. We've got this vault here. And when we use form, we're not setting the default value. So when we use form, let's set default value and we can set our vault. Go try this again, refresh. So if we refresh, we still don't see our vault appear. But if we come back to our index and change the default step to login, come back and refresh and we see our vault appear. And the reason is because we need our use effect to run before we render our vault. And our vault will only get rendered when the step is set to vault. And our vault up here will be populated and then we render our form. So now that we have our vault saving, let's go add our login and see if we can decrypt our vault when we log in. So I'm going to come back to server and I'm going to come back to user service. And inside of the user service, I'm going to create a function. So I'm going to export async function, find user by email and password. So you're going to be able to give this function an email address and a hashed password. And then you're going to be able to find that user if the email exists in the system and the hash password is correct for that user. Let's type these both out as strings. So I want to say const user is equal to await user model dot find one. And I want to find this user by their email address. I want to generate a hash. So I'm going to say const hash is equal to, and I'm going to create a function here to generate a hash. So I'm going to say async function gen hash. And this is just going to generate a hash from the password. So I'm going to pass in the password here, and I'm just going to return argon2 dot hash, and argon2 been imported oddly again. And I just want to hash the password. You can type this as a string. In your user model, when you hash the password, if you added the email address to the password hash, you'll also need to add the email address to this hash here, because we're going to use this to compare the user's password to validate it and make sure it's correct. So I'm going to say hash is equal to gen hash, and I'm going to pass in the hashed password. Then I'm going to say if not user or not argon2 dot verify user dot password, and we're going to compare this against the hash that we just created from the password that they tried to enter. Return null, because we haven't been able to find and verify the user. TypeScript is complaining here, and that's because genhash is going to return a promise. So we need to await this. Otherwise, we can return the user. Okay, so let's come to our user controller. And I'm going to export an async function called login handler. This is going to have a request and a reply. A request is going to be of type Fastify request. Again, we can type our body here and we can use parameter. So we did this up here where we got the parameter of create user, and that is going to be a hash password and email. And we can do the same. So let's copy that line. And then we can type out our Fastify reply. Next, we can say const user is equal to await find user by email and password. Then I want to pass in the request.body. And this is going to be our hashed password and email. If we don't have the user, then I just want to return a 401. So if not user, return reply.status 401.send. And I want to send back an object with a message, invalid email or password. Otherwise, I want to sign a JSON web token. So I'm going to say const access token. And we should be able to actually copy this from up above. Let's copy these two lines here where we create an access token and we sign a cookie. And we can actually copy this last line as well, where we reply. And I just want to reply with a 200 instead of a 201. We also need to find the vault. So let's come over to our vault service, and we need a function here to find the vault by its user. So I'm going to say export function find vaults by user. And this is going to take a user ID, it's going to be a string. I'm going to return vault model.find1 user is going to be a user ID. Okay, so when we find our user, I can say const vault is equal to await find vault by user, and we can pass in our user ID as user._ID. And to keep TypeScript happy, we can just put in some question marks here. And our salt is going to come from our vault. Okay, let's go add our login route handler. So under our register handler, I'm just going to copy this down and I'm going to have this on /login, and the handler is going to be login handler. So we can go create the UI for login. So when we register, we pass in pretty much all the same fields as when we want to log in. So I'm just going to copy our register form here, and then I'm going to paste it into our login form, and then I'm going to rename register form to login form. And now we just want to do a few different things when we log in. So I'm going to change the form heading to login, and I'm going to change the button to login. I'm going to come over to application, and I'm just going to clear out my session storage so I get the login form instead. Okay, so this looks good. Instead of calling register user, I want to call login user. So I'm just going to copy this function here, and I'm going to rename this to login user. And then the route is going to be, but it's going to be user base /login. The other thing that's going to be different is when we log in, we actually do have a vault, and we want to decrypt that vault. So I'm going to say const decrypted vault is equal to decrypt vault. I'm going to pass in the vault that we get back, and I'm going to pass in our vault key. Okay, so once we have our decrypted vault, I want to set it into session storage. So down here where we're just setting vault to an empty string, I want to set it to json.stringify decrypted vault. If we come back to index, you can see that we also have a vault here, and we're going to need to set this. So I'm going to pass set vault down into login. We also want to pass set step and set vault key. So let's go in and we just need to add set vault. And set vault is going to be of type dispatch, set state action, and then this is going to be a vault item, and it's going to be an array of vault items. If you're wondering how you can figure out what these types are, if you come over to where you pass them down and you hover over it, it tells you what it is here. So then I just copy this, and then I come back in, I paste it here, and I wouldn't have dispatch and set action item imported, for example. So VS Code's going to tell me they're not imported. So I'm just going to start typing it, dispatch. And then it's saying I can import that type from React. So that probably sounds right. And then set state action. And I can also import that from React, and that sounds right. And then I've resolved the types for these set state actions. Okay, so let's try login now. I'm going to use 1@1.com. The password is going to be password. And I'm getting a duplicate key error here. And I think this is because I've sent this to the root address here. And the reason for that is because in our mutation, we're actually calling register user and not login user. Let's try this again. Okay, we've logged in. We've got our access token, we've got our salt, and we've got our vault here. We've set our vault to null, which is fine. And we've set our vault key. Let's add some items. And save our vault. We have our vault here. We can refresh. Let's clear out these items and we can try login again. 1@1.com. Password. And you can see our vault has been set in local storage correctly. And so this means it's been decrypted, and it's also set our vault key here, but we don't see any items on screen. So let's go try debug that. So the reason for this is we're passing in set vault, but we're not actually using it. So we set our vault key. Let's also set our vault to our decrypted vault here. We can go try login again by clearing out our session storage. 1@1.com. Password. We can log in and we get our vault back. Just to prove that we're not actually storing any data on the server and we're only storing encrypted data, these are the vault objects that we created. So you can see here that this data is just an encrypted vault. So with just this information, you're not going to be able to decrypt it unless you can generate the vault key. And you can only generate the vault key if you know the master password and the master email address, and you can get the hash from the server. So that is how to build a password manager. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you like the video and please make sure you subscribed so you get notified every time I release a video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.